My name is Willard Watson. I'm the Programs and Outreach Director here at the Blowing Rock Art and History Museum. And tonight we're having a discussion we're calling Place Matters. And it's a roundtable discussing the intersections around land conservation, agriculture, and beauty. And tonight we're able to hear from Charlie Brady, the Executive Director of Blue Ridge Conservancy since 2017, a native North Carolinian and a graduate of Wake Forest University's Law School. He's a practicing lawyer before taking over the Blue Ridge Conservancy. We're also hearing from Dave Walker. Dave's the co-director of Blue Ridge Women in Agriculture, and he works on fundraising and strategic partnerships around agriculture in the high country of Western North Carolina. And Dave joined Blue Ridge Women in Agriculture in 2015 to develop its farmer mentorship program and has worked to connect producers and resources in our region. Dave also grows certified animal welfare approved pigs, potatoes, and other delicious vegetables in Valley Cruces under the farm name Daffodil Spring Farm. He's got 2 plots of land that are under agricultural conservation easements with the Blue Ridge Conservancy, including the Fig Farm, an incubator farm for beginning growers, and the Cooper Farm behind the original Mass store. His grandmother's Valley Cruces farm and home place also has parts under easement and with the Conservancy. And we're also fortunate to be joined by Bob Shipley. He's the manager of Watauga Butchery and partner in Shipley Farms Beef. Bob is a native of Watauga County, and from Bob's dad taught him to have a passion for his work, doing things the right way and serving people well. In fact, much of what happens at Watauga Butchery can be traced to Bob's dad, R.G. Shipley Sr. Bob's had a career in business spanning several decades, including launching and building multiple startups as an entrepreneur and serving investment clients with large firms in Raleigh, Charlotte, Atlanta, and Tampa. But his heart's always been in farming. And his first job after college was an assistant farm and livestock manager at John Umstead Hospital in Butner, North Carolina. After retiring from a career in financial services, Bob partnered with his son as well as their 100-year-old RG Sr. to launch the retail meats venture. Shipley Farms Beef is a family farming operation built on the legacy of R.G. Shipley Sr., a 1980 inductee in the North Carolina Agriculture Hall of Fame. The Shipley family has raised cattle as well as sheep and tobacco in years past in the valley just west of Boone for 150 years. In 2014, at 101 years old, RG, along with his son and grandson, began packaging and selling our beef as a dry-aged, pasture-raised, and locally grown product from a North Carolina mountain farm. So we've just got a great collection of people that have an expertise in just knowing the place that is northwestern North Carolina and being able to develop it for the agricultural purposes, something that's also part of the rich history and heritage of this region. So this talk is part of the exhibit that we have at the museum right now called Blue Ridge Conservancy Place Matters. So this exhibit documents the history of the Blue Ridge Conservancy since its early formation as 2 land conservation organizations in the 1990s and to what they're doing today. So I think it's great that we kick off the panel, Charlie, with you with this first question. What does conservation mean to you?
Well, I'd have to say one word really encapsulates the view of conservation to Blue Ridge Conservancy, and that would be forever, or a synonym in perpetuity. I think that's the most important part of conservation and the work that we do, is that we work to conserve land that will be the way it is for the end of time. And I think that's a really important distinction. It's something we're in for the long haul, something that's way beyond a 5-year plan or a 10-year plan, but preserving key properties, unique properties forever. And I really think that we need to be mindful of the unique place we live. It's almost like a cradle of conservation in Western North Carolina. It really dates back roughly 100 years with the legacy of some far reaching, forward-thinking people like the Cone family and the Price family, and then later people like Hugh Morton. Those people did so much to preserve really a lot of the landscape that we have in this area that is attractive to people, why people love to come here. And again, it's all part of the conservation in perpetuity.
Very good. Bob, to you, what does conservation mean to you?
I like your sentiment there that you were referring to, Charlie, with forever. I kind of start on a different one, and that is a mindset of stewardship. The reality is that none of us, as you mentioned, are going to be here in perpetuity, and none of us were here when it began. So we're all standing on the shoulders of other generations. But with that, what does that stewardship then apply in terms of a mindset? And it could be enumerated a number of ways there, but thinking about it, about time, talents, and treasures. And time is something that we're all equally shared with. You know, no one has more or less. Talents are divided in a lot of different ways. But then the treasure, I'm thinking of that is those things that we're given custody over for that time that we're here. And that involves physical things, and therein comes land, relationships, and other things. But then when you move to the treasure and the stewardship responsibility for that, and my mind, conservation then is applied to the treasure of the land, okay? And yeah, we can put air into that, but we don't technically, none of us have a title to air. That stewardship responsibility is both an individual and a collective role for those things that we share across undefined borders, water and air, but specifically for land. And in the farming business, most farmers are attached and their roots run deep into the soil that they have their fences around, or they grow their crops or their animals on. So the word conservation to me immediately then focuses on the stewardship for the land, okay, initially. And so in my mindset, for many folks as farmers, it kind of can be divided into maybe three visuals. And one is, what is it of that land that we can't see? In other words, what's under the surface? The responsibility for the soil health, and that's the nutrition, the microorganisms, all of the compaction, those various things that we don't see from the surface. Then what is it that we see on the surface? That is vegetation or the lack thereof. Okay, what's growing or not growing? And what's the stewardship responsibilities for managing that? And then the last thing from a farmer's point of view is, what is it that grows on top of that, that is the crop or the product or the animal that walks on those surfaces or drives on them, or how is that used? And so that's my mindset of conservation, is how does the stewardship for that time period fit in with the particular piece of tundra that whoever is given the custody of that for that time period. And I like your idea of the question of in perpetuity. If it's not well cared for, things have different outcomes. Well cared for can have positive outcomes. So that's a reference point that may help frame how I see conservation.
Yeah, and I think there's a recognition in the high country and in other places that there are many different complementary and at times competing values for land, and especially related to conservation work. I think about the land that's my grandmother's home place, and it's a really personal place for my family, and part of it's under conservation easement, and we all place, my whole family and different people place different values on it. And you know, some neighbors walk the property on a trail system that's up there, and I farm some pigs right adjacent to it. There are a lot of different different values that are placed on it by different people, and I think the structure of it being under easement lends it to that really well, and so it opens it up to those different types of uses. And I think, and maybe Charlie or Bob could speak to this too, but the conservation movement's always evolving and moving in different directions.
Yeah, that was great. You all, I just love how all of you have different approaches, but still at the core, you know, this attachment to the land. Now, Dave, this next question I'd like you to take first. How does food and conservation intersect in your work at?
It does in a couple of ways. And so with my day job in town with Blue Ridge Women in Agriculture, are at times asked by farmers about transition plans. And so thinking about the future and what's going to happen to their property. And so I'm able to guide them to different resources that are available, like the Conservancy or NRCS or North Carolina Farm Link, to have those conversations. Also, farmers are frequently asking about what kind of resources are out there for them to improve the soil conditions on their property, or to think about green energy. And there are lots of programs that are out there for them to work with a cost share on those at the local level and then at the regional level. And then with myself on my farm, 2 of those properties are under easement with Blue Ridge Conservancy. And so they'll always be undeveloped. And so it's a intersecting and big part of the different work that I do. And related to food, you know, it helps. Food and farming are tied to conservation for a really long time. This morning I was thinking about, I was driving past where my grandmother was born on Dutch Creek, and in 1940 there was a really significant flood in our area, but also across the United States and in the Mississippi, in West Virginia, and it washed away her house. And around that time, those type of weather events and thinking about the soil became a big focus of the USDA and our federal government. And so a lot of programs were instituted then to hold our soil and to regenerate it. And today, a lot of farmers look back to those programs and those resources that were created for small scale farms at that time, and see them as inspiration and as technical guides for the work that they're doing now. And so there are a lot of deep connections between conservation movement and food and local food.
That's great that those resources from decades ago are still having their impact today. It just goes to show how, especially with dealing with things like the land, you're looking at a multi-generational scale. Now, speaking of multi-generational scale, Bob, you're working on land that's been in use for over 150 years now, right? So how does conservation and factor into your work?
Well, in your introduction, you made reference to Dad some. My dad was a VOAG teacher and born in 1918 or 1913. And so as a VOAG teacher, helping folks gain a living off of the land. In agriculture in the 30s, probably 75% of the American workforce, probably in the 30s, was still involved. Well, it may not have been that much, but certainly was in the 50% of the US workforce still was involved in agriculture. So today we're down to less than 1.5% of the population is involved in direct production agriculture. So the number of people that are fed by the folks that are in farming, if we're going to call it productive farming, is getting less and less. And so turn that around. The number of people that are producing is less and less, and the number of people that are feeding are more and more. And so therefore, there's a smaller percentage of the population that has any direct connection to the roots of the soils and the land. And so when one earns their living out of that, and you speak about the generations, it just provides a different set of emotional ties. You know, yes, there's the beauty, but there's just the simple issue of living. So in our world right now, historically, on this land right here, it's about 115 acres, that has been producing basically breeding stock for livestock. There's been other elements, but the core competency over the years has been seed stock. My grandfather had brought the first registered Hereford bull to North Carolina years ago. So that's again part of that legacy and part of that foundation. But moving then specifically to what are we doing right now, Willard, with our food and conservation, is that beef cattle are the primary occupants that are walking the soil here, okay? We're not growing any crops other than pasture, okay, on the farm. So with that, land is critical for particularly of the livestock population. Beef is the one that is most dependent upon land. You can concentrate chickens, you can concentrate hogs, but it is impossible to concentrate the entire life cycle of a beef animal. So generally, in most places around the country, particularly out west, the beef business is a byproduct of land ownership, okay? It's not too many people that say, I want to go into the beef business, where can I buy some land and start that, okay? It's the reverse. So these are people that have owned land and have been passionate about it for decades. So specifically with pasture and requiring space, anything that inhibits the production of good forages inhibits the desired outcome. So in simple terms, in my little microcosm that we're working in at the moment, the beef cattle are harvesting the nutrients that come out of the soil. And so all of that's critical. There was a statement that I recall my dad saying many times as we traveled the country in one place or another, and he said, you can see this. And he asked me to be critical about making this observation. And I invite others to apply the same test and see if it's valid from their observations. When the soil is fertile, you very seldom, if ever, see poverty. An interesting correlation. So healthy soils support healthy communities and produce healthy food.
Yeah, it's beautiful how you put that. Healthy soils support healthy communities. So Charlie, how does food intersect with conservation at the Blue Ridge Conservancy?
I loved Bob's comment also, Willard, about fertile soils and poverty. That was really thought-provoking concept. The question, of course, is how does food and conservation intersect in our work? So food, of course, is produced from land. And as Bob said, land is critical in terms of necessities for agriculture. And that is one of the key parts of the mission of Blue Ridge Conservancy, and that is to partner with communities and landowners to permanently protect natural resources that have unique value. And one of those unique values that we work to preserve is agricultural land. So it's part of our core mission. And through the years, we've been quite successful at conserving family farms and agricultural land in the 7 counties that we serve, from Yancey down in the Burnsville area all the way to the Virginia line in Allegheny. Allegheny is an area where Blue Ridge Conservancy has conserved really several thousands of acres in agricultural land. And one of the members of that community, I remember when I first came on board, said that Allegheny used to tout that there were more cows in Allegheny than there were people. And I believe that was actually statistically correct. So food and land conservation is really important, because when we're talking about healthy communities, we're talking about communities that have clean water, clean air, and really great local food. And so those are some things that really are keys to conserving places that matter. Some of our strongest advocates and conservationists that support Blue Ridge Conservancy have been people in the agricultural community. Really, I've got to thank Dave Walker. Again, he farms on several of the tracts that we've protected, particularly in the Valley Crucis area. And so he lives it. He's takes advantage of the properties that we've been able to protect through the years. A healthy food system is so important to us, and we've increasingly tried to work toward protecting more agricultural family farms, because they're beginning to disappear in this area.
So it's good that you mentioned that there are a lot of people working with you in the Conservancy have been farmers and people that own agricultural land. Now, have there been any people that were conservationists in the area that were also artists that you know of?
There are, and I think I mentioned one in the beginning, that of course art takes different forms and different mediums, but I think one of the, again, most forward-thinking conservationists in our region that really embody a lot of why we're here and the goals of Blue Ridge Conservancy was Hugh Morton, one of the most accomplished photographers, I think, in the history of North Carolina. I believe you've had an exhibit at BRAHM of some of his photography. So he's really one of the unparalleled conservationists that's an artist. One of my favorites, honestly, on a different scale, but still just as important, because it takes many people doing work at different levels. And that's another artist that has exhibited at BRAHM. I think she's an active member of the organization. I know a year or two ago, she had an exhibit at the Dangerfield House, and that's Kathy Reese. Kathy and Wade Reese have really devoted great resources and really a lot of their energy and time to protecting land along the Watauga River that they own. They've been a model almost for people in the community of what can be done to protect areas, particularly in a riparian area like the Watauga River. Those are two artists that come to mind. There are probably others, but those are two that I personally knew Hugh and know Kathy and Wade and have the greatest respect for.
Yeah, this past, or the winter of 2019, 2020, BRAHM, we hosted an exhibit of Hugh Morton's photography, the Hugh Morton, An Uncommon Perspective. And these were 50 photographs from his collection of at University of Chapel Hill. And it was incredible because it spanned the state of North Carolina and the culture and history and some the sports and other parts of the state, but a lot of the land and a lot of landscapes and just this appreciation for the natural beauty. And it's just wonderful what they've done at Grandfather Mountain and what the Grandfather Stewardship Foundation is doing now. So that's great that so many people can unite around agreeing that this is a beautiful area that we live in. The natural beauty of the region has attracted artists and farmers and visitors alike for generations. Now, is a beautiful natural environment necessarily a more productive or healthy environment? Like, is a beautiful farm a better functioning farm, or a beautiful forest better functioning forest?
Is that a question to me? I'm happy to try to work
Whoever
on that.
like to jump in.
I think certainly beauty takes different forms, but a beautiful forest or a beautiful farm, Bob and Dave probably obviously have a lot more personal experience in it than I do. But a lot of the visitors and people that live in this area do appreciate the beauty of a working farm and as well as a beautiful forest. And not all forests being untouched, some of those forests that are managed actually are more productive for wildlife and various wild creatures than completely protected forests. But there are certain areas that need total protection, but other areas lend themselves well to management. And it gets back to stewardship that Bob talked about in the beginning to me. When Bob mentioned that, back to Hugh Morton for a moment, that was what he always talked about. He said, I really don't own this mountain. I'm just the steward for the time that I'm on this earth. And so that is part, I think, of managing property. To me, a working farm is a beautiful environment. And so I don't think that one eliminates the other, actually.
Yeah, I would agree. I think they complement each other really well. With the built environment, it's not a really diverse environment, and on some farms, many farms, we're trying to weed out different species and weed out diversity. But there's so many benefits to having that kind of diversity and that kind of conserved land adjacent to farmland when we're talking about birds and pollinators and healthy soil and clean water. And so they can be really good complements to each other. Out in Valley Crucis, it's kind of a mecca for a lot of conserved land, and people are always commenting, especially now, about how many birds are out there, and that just makes it a more beautiful place to be, and a more biologically diverse and rich place for everything.
Yeah, I'll comment just briefly there. I think, Charlie, when you said that there were a lot of folks that have paved the way, and I had made notes earlier and named exactly the same folks that you did there, with Hugh Morton and Moses Cone and Julian Price and George Vanderbilt with Biltmore. And as most everyone probably on the group knows, that, you know, the cradle of forestry, you know, was begun at Biltmore, the first school of forestry in the country for managed forest land was established by George Vanderbilt. And so the issue of management is not an oxymoron for conservancy. And to say that something needs to be left in its natural state might be drawn from a quick story where a visitor was commenting to a farmer and said, "Oh man, the Lord really gave you a beautiful place here." And the farmer said, "Yeah, and you should have seen it when he had it by himself." So the question of what is beauty is a question that is unique to different people, certainly color, contrast, texture, and you see all of that in part with what you're looking at, say, with the Blue Ridge Parkway there, where that effort to allow a trip through the mountains of North Carolina, and from those vistas you see in the fall, the color from mountaintop to mountaintop. But you also drive by some pastures and see open green pastures that are well cared for. And so that contrast makes beauty. And so the question, I think, is framed in the question about productivity, is how do we live in harmony, as you were talking there, Charlie, with what is the appropriate and the best practices and uses of land and terrain and water. And some of those are only suited for certain kinds of applications, and others need to be very carefully managed, and others may need to be left pristine and untouched. But it is a question of living in harmony, and working in harmony with that does create beauty.
Yeah, well put. And just talking about the Blue Ridge Conservancy just brings me back to thinking about Moses Cone again. The Cone family, in addition to just conserving 3,000 acres, I believe, of land for their estate and making the memorial park, they managed that property. When Moses was filling out his paperwork to get his passport to travel the world at the start of the 20th century, he put farmer in as his occupation. And he had actually done incredible work to manicure and manage the landscape of those 3,000 acres by building tons of orchards and managed orchards with apples and pears and quinces and cherries and blueberries. The very first railroad system in Watauga County, it was a mile-long light rail strip put up on Cone Manor to go from the apple orchards to the packing house. And just thinking about the people that he employed through that, the local people he employed, but also he purchased the trees and the shrubs from local nurseries, that there were receipts from nurseries in Newland of him buying thousands of pear trees and peach trees. So just thinking about how that conservation and also supporting the people and living in harmony with the land in that respect. And also the Cone family being massive art collectors and having an impact on the art community here. So it's really nice to see how those can intersect, and people, farmers and conservationists and artists can all get along. But it seems that sometimes the public narrative pits farmers against conservationists, or there are a lot of stories about those two butting heads. So what causes some of those problems to arise, and how can farmers and conservationists be allies?
So the question is, how can they be allies? I would say this issue of harmony, a broad oversight, is that we make decisions based upon the things that we believe and or value. And generally we value those things that we believe strongly, okay? And we make those decisions based upon things we've learned, we've been taught, we've seen, or our experiences. And so experiences are unique to individuals, okay? Principles are not unique to individuals. You like your hair a little longer than I like mine. Mine, I didn't get to color. It's this natural color. Okay. My point is that the question of what is a principle that can be applied across all people, gravity applies to everyone. So when we speak about conservation and farmers, there should be no opposition to conservation. And I would think for the majority of people that are in production agriculture, that is a passion that they would find a like mind to. I think where the conflict or the deviation may occur is where we have feelings and beliefs, okay, that we may be passionate about, that we're perfectly entitled to, but may not be based on fact, okay? So going back to the early roots of an organization that has had a nationwide impact on agriculture, and that's the Future Farmers of America. And in that organization, when the meeting begins, there's a statement, and one of those is about the advisor. And the advisor makes a statement that says, being older than you, and he was referring to students in that case, from time to time, I'm called upon to give you advice. I hope that my advice will always be, and here is the big rock in that one, will always be based on true knowledge, which to me is fact and principle, and then ripened with wisdom. What's the application, the differences and the preferences of the population that live in the space, okay? And when we show deference to preferences, but we recognize principles, then there should be an outcome of harmony, I would believe. That's one approach.
Yeah, I think community scale farmers, the ones who are growing local food for their community, really do care about the soil and the land because they care about their customers and where their food goes to. And so they're closer to the work that they do. And I think it's more obvious in their work, their dedication. And I think, yeah, there are programs out there for them to take advantage of that support conservation, that are really geared towards smaller scale farms and that they can benefit from. Some of what we might read in the news about larger scale farms are really quite different from the farms that we have up here in the high country, and it's hard to paint all farms as a monolith. It's the same.
Yeah.
From the Blue Ridge Conservancy perspective, I really see that conservation and farming and agriculture is really more aligned way more often than not. And I think maybe particularly in this particular time, farming and agriculture may value conservation even more. And part of that is of what we've seen in the last year going into this year, and that is a boom in terms of land being purchased, not for agricultural use, but land being purchased for development and homes. And so there are family farms that are might well disappear, other agricultural land that is maybe, Bob, your words, really good fertile land, but it may be lost forever to development. And so there's a unity, I think, of a common interest there, at least, with Blue Ridge Conservancy and the agriculture or farming community to protect that land. And I want to, maybe everybody on this Zoom call understands that Blue Ridge Conservancy, the core of what we do is based on working with willing landowners. I mean, we can't dictate to anybody what they do. So we protect land that people want to have protected. We do that by mostly with farming conservation easements, that people want to preserve their land as a family farm. Sometimes they do it as a gift. Maybe it helps them with a tax deduction. Sometimes there are certain financial incentives that help farmers to place the conservation easement on their land. That's one of the tools we use. But I see farming, agriculture, and conservation working really well together. And just one story, for example, Blue Ridge Conservancy came about from a merger of what was called the Blue Ridge Rural Land Trust and High Country Conservancy. And the Blue Ridge Rural Land Trust had a real heavy focus in Ashe and Allegheny County. And the founder of that, the original person and main mover and shaker in Blue Ridge Rural Land Trust, was a man named James Coman. And James Coman was a farmer up in Allegheny County. And he worked, it was all about acres. How many acres could we protect? Because they were determined to protect as much of Allegheny's farmland as they could. So it's a good example, really, of how agriculture and conservation had mutual interests and worked hard to do that. And as an aside, James Coman eventually passed away, and the farm was left to his nephew. And the nephew farms that land today. He has cattle and sheep and different types of livestock. And he never thought that he was going to get into farming, but his uncle had looked forward and actually planned well to preserve that land. And now his nephew, Jay, is a well-known farmer in Allegheny and does what you do, Dave. I mean, he sells meat products. I don't know if he goes to your butchery, Bob, but he's in your world. And that's all come about because conservationists and farmers developed that conservation plan for that property.
And I think Jay grew up in Raleigh. He didn't grow up on the farm, and but he's been really important in Allegheny County to help connect other farmers who are trying to sell their products to that community and get it off the mountain into Raleigh and other places.
You're right. You know, he's a young farmer and he didn't have that background. And Jay tells the story, but it's an hilarious story. He inherited the property, but he wasn't sure he was going to farm. And so he would go down to the county store, wherever it was. And so one of the guys he knew said, man, you need to get a couple calves and let's, get started in a small scale. And Jay said, he told that guy, said, man, I don't want to have any cows up there, those calves up there. He said, they're going to bite me. And so to this day, he says they laugh at him and ask him about those biting cows that he was afraid of. But Jay's a good one and another good farmer conservationist.
Yeah.
That's wonderful. It's always great hearing about that. There's intergenerational connections to the land, and then for those young people to continue to keep the land productive and carry on that family tradition. I mean, just like Bob said earlier, that it's like less than 1% of the U.S. population are working farmers, where it used to be 70% of the population. So it seems like people have really lost a connection to place, right? So how does place, that connection to place and to the land, like factor into your work? Whoever wants to start.
Let me touch it there for just a second. Drawing on your reference there to the number of people that are connected to the soil. We all get fed once a day or twice a day or 3 times a day, okay? There's a lot of other experiences that we do not have with the same frequency we have with eating. So the question of getting the connection with where our food comes from and what's involved with the production of it is unknown to such a high percentage of people. So creating an experience, not necessarily of somebody feeding cows, but that experience can come from seeing, visiting, becoming aware of all of these elements that go into the story, whether it is flowers or cucumbers, tomatoes, hogs, livestock, sheep, whatever the case may be, seeing that being produced and creating an environment, and it's part of, quote, an educational mindset. There is a marketing element of it. And talking with the folks at the Department of Agriculture this morning on something, they were saying the two things that folks are that have been identified as major interest are getting out, okay, and learning more about food from their point of view of experiences. So out of this pandemic comes an increased awareness on the part of all the rest of the population about food in our world. When ground beef wasn't available in a grocery store, we literally got telephone calls from all over the country simply because there was a website that said ground beef. And what does that do? They were searching for a food item that they valued. So what I'm just saying is that there's a lot of opportunity to enable folks to visit farms, and we as farmers and producers, folks like Dave that are helping all the rest of the community, be proactive in letting people get connected in one way or another to folks that are involved in production agriculture. And some of that may be social media and other things, but we're unique here in the high country because we have people that come here, don't stay here, and then go back home. So we are in a unique position to tell a story in this area because of the beauty of it, and then what is being grown up here that they can be able to take back home and say, I value that.
Yeah, I think that's right on. And, you know, I think we all place different values on land. Like my grandmother left the farm as soon as she could in the 1950s. And then my parents, when they visit, they see hiking trails and things like that. And then when I look at the family farm, I see a place where I can put pigs or grow potatoes. And, you know, I think they're all complementary. And I think the Conservancy and farms do a really good job of negotiating those different values and different uses. And, you know, one really good example is Cooper Farm that adjoins the Valley Cruces Park. And Dutch Creek runs right between it. It's on the Watauga River. And so there's places for wildlife, and then for anglers. There are hiking trails for people who want to walk and birders. And then there's also plots for people like me and Matt Cooper to grow vegetables. So there are all these different uses. And then there's also the educational component of signage. And you know, the Conservancy's done a good job about doing walks and hikes for people who are interested in learning about this place where we get to live. And so I think there are just so many different opportunities there.
Thanks, Dave, for mentioning the Cooper Farm. We've got a good partnership with you and Matt Cooper there, and is certainly a great resource for not just the people in Valley Cruces, but people all over the area. With Blue Ridge Conservancy, you know, and you've described it, Dave. Place matters, and places are different to different people. It could be that family farm that provided this stability and nourishment and purpose for generations of farmers. It could be a place that, like for me, when I was young and young adult, included water for trout fishing and the woods for hunting. For others, it could be a hiking trail. There's so many different components to what place really means. But place does matter to all of us in different ways. But it is one thing, the land is really what connects all of us. And so one of the things I wanted to interject here is the tagline that not just Blue Ridge Conservancy uses, but land trusts all over the country. saving the places you love. And I think it's really important for us all to acknowledge and remember to hone in on that word you. Who is you, and who are the people that are appreciating this? And I think we all need to be working to be more inclusive of what that you includes. There are a lot of people in this world, in this country, that don't feel comfortable in some of these places that Blue Ridge Conservancy and others are working hard to protect. So I think it's incumbent upon all of us, when we're talking about place matters, that it's a place that people of all walks of life, socioeconomic, race, whatever, can feel comfortable and use, because once those people that understand that, hey, we're all in this together, there's going to be a much greater groundswell of support to protect and preserve and steward, as Bob said, this land that's so important to all of us. I think in the past, maybe we've been too myopic of what when we say places that you love, we need to make sure we've got that big tent of who all we're trying to reach when we're talking about that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's wonderful that just all of y'all's responses. I've really enjoyed this conversation this evening. And so one thing you've all talked about are ways for people to get involved. So my last question are, what resources are available to farmers and landholders that are interested in conservation? And, you know, or how can just regular old folks get involved in general?
Oh, I'll hit that one real quickly as a start, because we're the recipients and the beneficiaries of both of these organizations, and I know them reasonably well. And that's the North Carolina Ag Extension, okay? And so in basically every county across the country, there's an Ag Extension office. North Carolina is unique and special. I can say that from experience, in that the strength that we have with our Ag Extension offices and NC State University is one of the top half a dozen in the country, okay? So they are a great asset, and whether somebody is trying to steward a 50 by 50 front yard that they want to grow beautiful grass and flowers, they're a great resource. Or if it's production agriculture with plants, food, livestock. So you cannot say enough good about the Ag Extension Service, and give them a resource there at the county level, regardless of where they are. And if somebody is visiting in the Blowing Rock area and going back to another part of the country, there's Ag Extension there for master gardeners up and down the road. And then the second on that is soil and water conservation folks, okay? Another organization that deals in the sweet spot of all these things that we're talking about that we share in common, water and soil. And those are two fantastic organizations. I'm sure all of us that are on this side of the table that have used them would be able to sing their accolades.
I agree, and that's a great. Those are great places to start, and there are tons of different programs for all different scales. NRCS is the federal kind of complement to Soil and Water, which is the county office, and then there's some programs like BRAHM, our electric cooperative, and they have programs for landowners to keep land in kind of a brushy habitat form underneath power lines. And so there are lots of different programs out there for all different types of landholders to take advantage of.
Bob and Dave are right. Those I was going to mention Soil and Water and Extension. In addition, for timber management and such, the North Carolina Forest Service is a really invaluable organization as well. They help landowners develop forest plans so that there's some science involved in how timber is managed both from agricultural standpoint, but also wildlife management standpoint. In terms of our specific work at Blue Ridge Conservancy, I mentioned it earlier, we don't have enough time to go into detail, but the conservation easement tool is probably the most common that we use in working with a farmer that wants to protect their land, and that can end up helping them financially, actually. So if you knew of farmers, or if you had some connection to a farm and wanted to explore that, I'd encourage you to reach out to us. The state of North Carolina also has money in a trust fund that's similar to the North Carolina Land and Water Fund, which used to be Clean Water Management Trust Fund. And it's an agricultural preservation trust fund that's managed through the North Carolina Department of Agriculture. And so there's money available there to farmers for farm easements and different land conservation uses. So that's another statewide tool that's available in North Carolina.